Hello, how are you? My name's David Alley, and this is the first of, hopefully, many Tobi talks. Tobi stands for Topics of Biblical Interest. And the idea we had here at Peace was that we should do some interesting talks, kind of like TED Talks, just short, but about things that you might not normally hear on a Sunday morning in church. And some of them, there's questions we all have as Christians, like what happened to Noah's Ark and things like that. So anyway, here is the first of those talks today, and I hope you find it interesting. Today we're going to talk about what language was on the Ten Commandment tablets, because it may not be what you were thinking. In 2015, I was traveling. I was in America, and I was in Dallas, Texas, and I attended a conference, a pretty particular special conference with a lot of high-profile Christians. And there was a speaker that came on, and he began his talk, and he was talking about the moment when God created the earth. And you know, in the book of Genesis, the first words that are recorded as having been spoken by God was where God said, "Let there be light." And so the very, very first Hebrew word that's come out of the mouth of God is this one that I'm about to put up an image that you should hopefully be able to see, a Hebrew word on your screen right now. And so this Hebrew word was what this speaker was talking about in that conference in Dallas. And he had all this really fancy stuff to say about these Hebrew letters. You know, the symbology of them all, and what did it mean, and what was God thinking when he said these things. And as I sat there, it sounded really, really compelling. I mean, it was gripping. The points that he was making were interesting, but something wasn't quite right about what he was saying. And so one of the reasons that it wasn't quite right is one of the big problems with his presentation is that those letters could not possibly have been used, or God could not have possibly have said those things in Genesis 1 verse 1. Those letters actually came from the Babylonian period. They didn't come from the Hebrew period. That might be a little bit surprising for you, and it's surprising for a lot of Christians. There's been a few times in my life I've debated with other pastors about this, trying to explain the Babylonian origins of the Hebrew alphabet. And they're always shocked when I say that. So let's go back and start talking about the Ten Commandments. What I want to show on the screen right now is a picture of Rembrandt's painting of the Ten Commandments. Rembrandt, famous, painter from about 400 or 500 years ago, and he painted the Ten Commandments. And if you look closely at the Ten Commandments, you will see the Hebrew writing that is on them. And that's what we normally expect to see on the Ten Commandments, Hebrew writing. But however, I want to show you another picture of the Ten Commandments. Now, this picture comes from the movie, The Ten Commandments, with Charlton Heston acting as Moses. And these Ten Commandments that are in the picture are a prop. And standing next to them is Cecil B. DeMille, the famous movie director who produced The Ten Commandments. What an amazing movie it was. And for the times, of course, the cinematography was incredible. And, you know, when they opened up the Red Sea and the water was split, that was all amazingly done without the help of computers. Incredible stuff. But look at those Ten Commandments. What's actually on them? That's not the Hebrew that we're used to seeing, right? Have you ever noticed that before when you watch the Ten Commandments movie? Well, what you're actually looking at there is not the Hebrew square script that we're used to. It's called Paleo-Hebrew, or Old Hebrew. And so this is still the Hebrew language, but it's not the Hebrew alphabet that we're used to seeing. It's an older alphabet, and it's not written. This alphabet didn't come from the Hebrew people, and Rembrandt, of course, probably didn't know that. So when he painted his Ten Commandments, he just painted them the way that he thought and the way that we always tend to assume. But what happened was that when the children of Israel, they weren't giving God the proper attention he deserved, they were disobeying him, they weren't following him, the prophets told them to stop, they didn't listen, and so the Lord sent the Babylonians. And the Babylonians carted them all off into exile, And when they were in exile, they learnt another language. They learnt the language of Aramean. And when you read the book of Daniel, and Daniel is there in exile, and it says in Daniel chapter 1 and 2, it says that they were taught the language and the customs of the Babylonians. And another one of the people that went into exile is Ezra the scribe, one of the most significant believers of the Old Testament. And he wrote a huge big chunk of the Old Testament, but he wrote it with an alphabet that he learned when he was in captivity in Babylon. So imagine for a minute that we were, invaded by some people. Let's make up a scenario. Let's say it's New Zealanders. They invade Australia. Let's say they don't like the alphabet we're using and they decide to change the alphabet. And so they give us a new alphabet. And I've got a picture I'm going to put up on the screen. And it's imagine if all the alphabet, instead of the 26 letters that we're used to, were 26 different characters. So instead of God being G-O-D, God could be, we'd still say God, but we wouldn't write God like G-O-D. We'd write God like what you're seeing on the screen. So what would have changed is our alphabet, but our language would have stayed the same. But what happened when the children of Israel went to Babylon is that their alphabet changed, but their language changed as well. Both changed. They changed from using the old Paleo alphabet to using the square script alphabet, but they also changed from speaking Hebrew to speaking Aramean or Aramaic. And but the educated people, these are the most highly educated people like the priests, they continued to speak the Hebrew, but they continued to write the Hebrew with the new alphabet. So we've had a change. We've had a change of language for the common people, but we've also had a change of alphabet. So even those who did still speak Hebrew, which were the priests, they actually now wrote the Hebrew with a new alphabet, and that's the one we're used to seeing. And I want to show you something really, really interesting. It comes from the Gospel of John. It's, I think it's chapter 19, verse 20, and there's a picture of this. I'm going to pop it up on the screen, and it's Jesus. He's been nailed to the cross. Pontius Pilate gets the order that they're going to write that he was the King of the Jews in 3 languages, and they're going to nail it up right above Jesus, above the cross. And look on the screen. What does it say? It says that the 3 languages that were used were Greek, Latin, and Aramaic. And you can see here that the lingua franca, or the common language that everyone was using, was not Hebrew, but Aramaic. But the Aramaic was written with that square script alphabet, the one that we're used to associating with Hebrew. And so when Jesus, was going around ministering, he was ministering not in Hebrew, but in Aramaic. So the Hebrew language really took a hit. It wasn't very commonly used. Now, if you're someone who's read your Bible a lot over the years, you're going to say, but hang on, doesn't that passage say that it was nailed up to the cross in Hebrew and Latin and Greek? And if you go get a different translation of your Bible to the NIV, it will say Hebrew and Latin and Greek. You're right. And if you read the old King James, it also says Hebrew and Latin and Greek there. I'll tell you why. Because in the Greek language that this was written, it says that the languages were Hebraisti, Hellenisti, and Romanisti. Well, Romanisti is Roman or Latin, Hellenisti is Hellenic or Greek, and Hebraisti sounds like Hebrew, doesn't it? And so for a long, long time, since the days of the King James translation right through to now, all the scholars thought, oh, Hebraisti must be Hebrew, because it even sounds like it. But recently scholars have come to realise that no, it wasn't Hebrew, it was the language that the Hebrew people spoke, which was Aramaic. And we know that because there's actually 7 places in the Gospels or in the New Testament where this word Hebraisti is used, and 2 of them, John actually mentions the word. Like, for example, they say that in the Hebraisti language it's called blah, and he says the word blah, and that word's actually not a Hebrew word, but an Aramaic word. So we've actually come to realise that Hebraisti doesn't mean Hebrew, it means the language that the Hebrew people spoke. So there you go. The Ten Commandments were not written with that square script alphabet. But were they written in Hebrew? That's a really, really good question. So consider these thoughts. When Abraham, long, long time ago, when he moved to Canaan, when the Lord told him to move, what language did Abraham speak? Well, it wasn't Hebrew. It was probably Chaldean, Babylonian. But then, of course, Abraham's children, let's say Isaac, he would have spoke Chaldean, the same of his dad, but then he got himself a wife from Aram. What language would his wife and that whole family have spoken? Aramean. Same with Jacob. He got a wife from that area, two wives from that area as well. But then Jacob's children, they all ended up in Egypt. What language would they have spoken there? Well, we're not sure. They probably learnt Egyptian as well. But then Moses, he was educated by Egyptians in the ways of the Egyptians. So from the time he was a little child. So he would definitely have spoken Egyptian. And all the slaves living in Egypt, what languages would they have spoken? Most likely they did speak Egyptian, but they would also have spoken some form of their own language, which, was it Hebrew or was it not? Not sure. And so what we're saying here is that in all the early years before the children lived in the Promised Land, they spoke a lot of different languages, including Egyptian and Babylonian and Aramean. So there's such a diversity of languages going on there, including probably their own language, the Hebrew language. And so when they come out of Egypt and they're in the desert and the Lord comes down and the Lord writes on the Ten Commandments, what language was on the Ten Commandments? And you know what the honest answer to that question is? We don't know. But we do know one thing that's for sure. When Rembrandt painted his painting with the Hebrew square script, it definitely was not that. And we know another thing for sure, that in the beginning when the Lord said, "Let there be light," it was not Hebrew. So that speaker in Dallas years ago, he was really getting into his presentation, going on about that Hebrew letter. And the Hebrew letters that I showed you in that first picture, they were the square script letters. Well, as exciting as that presentation was in Dallas, it wasn't correct. The symbology of it wasn't correct. It was enthusiastic, and maybe the application had some value. But I think as Christians, we sometimes get hung up on language, like we think a certain language is holy, as though God has picked a language, like Hebrew, for example, and he's made it to be the one most important language in all of history. But God's not really like that. God hasn't picked one language to be holy. Like he hasn't picked the Hebrew language to be holy. The Greek language that the New Testament written in was just the common Greek language. It was the language of day-to-day speech. Some people think that the King James translation of the Bible is kind of like a holy translation. It's like super special. But no, the English language isn't any more special than the Hebrew or the Greek or the Chaldean or the Egyptian. In the end, what I've come to conclude is that God uses all languages for his purpose. And it's so exciting to me that the Bible has now been translated into more than 1,000 languages. So if you were going to say that one language is holy, you'd have to say they're all holy because they're all used for the Lord's purposes. I've got one more picture I want to show you. And if you look at this picture, this is one of the scrolls that was discovered in the Dead Sea. The Dead Sea Scrolls discovery at Qumran. And in that first cave, it was a fascinating discovery, and I'd love to talk to you in another Tobi talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls. But this here is the famous Leviticus scroll, and you'll notice that the writing on it is the old Hebrew. It's the Paleo Hebrew. So that just goes to show that this scroll dates back to before the Babylonian exile. So this scroll was actually quite old, written before the children of Israel were sent off to Babylon. Isn't that amazing? So, what language was the Lord speaking in Genesis 1:1 when he said, "Let there be light"? We have no idea. That's a mystery. That's just, the Lord alone knows what he was speaking in when he said that. What language was the Ten Commandments written in? We don't know that either. But what we do know is that the Lord speaks to us through the languages that we understand. Thank God for that. And in the New Testament, it says in John 1:1 that Jesus is the Word. So not only is God speaking to us through languages that we understand, but Jesus himself is the language of God. He's the revelation of God. Jesus is the Word. The person of Jesus Christ is truth to us, and I think that's the most fabulous thing of all. So thanks for listening to this Tobi Talk today. Don't get too hung up on the Hebrew, but do enjoy the Hebrew, just like we enjoy God's communication to us however it comes. God bless you, and thank you for listening to me today.